You may have heard that there are churchgoers in Louisville, Kentucky, who recently went into a public library in a neighboring county where they checked out and are now refusing to return children's books that they deemed were sexually perverse. I believe it was 16 book titles in total that are centering on LGBT identities, sexually explicit content. What's your immediate reaction to something like that? Certainly an unorthodox way of addressing it. Let's go in and take these books and then just not return them.
My initial response is, where do I send a donation to help this continue? All right. How do I help fund this mission? Respectfully, I don't think that any school should have books that seek to indoctrinate children into heterosexuality or into homosexuality, into transgenderism, into bestiality, and all of these other isms and schisms of our culture. I don't think that should be the focus of education. We should teach students how to think, not simply what to think. That's what we should teach kids. But however, I'm steeped in this topic. I've now traveled to 21 states, speaking up for kids, fighting against filth. Some people call it indoctrination, but I like to call it mental rape, because it assaults the soul, it stains the brain, and it robs kids of their innocence. This book right here that I'm holding up is entitled Worm Loves Worm by J.J. Austrian and Mike Curato. This book is for kids ages 4 and up. And the focus of this book is that it talks about same-sex marriage. There are two worms in this book that ultimately end up getting married. One of the pages says, "But which one of you is the bride? Ask the bees. And how can we be bride's bees if we don't know who the bride is?" And then one of the worms says, "I can be the bride," says worm. And the other worm says, "I can too," says worm. And so both of the worms are going to be the bride, and then both of the worms are going to be the groom. And then the worms seek to get married. And so they ask Cricket in this book, the preacher, Cricket, the preacher, to marry them. And it says, "Wait," says Cricket, "this isn't how it's always been done." And then the worms say, "Then we'll just change how it's done," says worm. "Yes," says worm. And so this book is for kids ages 4 and up, and it pushes same-sex marriage on them. Now, just because the Supreme Court has made it legal for 2 men and 2 women to get married, it doesn't make it right. Heaven doesn't endorse the marital bond between 2 men and 2 women. But this has been the movement afoot in the American education system. And it's why even I launched my YouTube channel. You can go to John Amanchukwu to find out more about the episodes that I do on this same issue. You can go to John Amanchukwu as well on YouTube and see my documentary that details my national campaign on how to bring common sense back to education and to reclaim schools and communities.
I want to talk, John, about what motivated you to get into this fight. But first, I want to ask you, how do you think we got to this place as a culture to begin with, where we're, sending our kids to schools and to libraries where they can check out books that are like this?
Well, Isaiah 5:20 says, "Woe to those who call evil good and good evil, who put darkness for light, light for darkness, bitter for sweet, and sweet for bitter." When you start calling same-sex marriage and transgenderism and diversity, equity, and inclusion, and even critical race theory good, that's where this comes from. But there's been a movement afoot by Marxist atheists for a long time to deconstruct Christianity and to push this ideology upon kids. Alice Bailey has been one of the main propagators of this content and information through her plan to create a society where Christ was dethroned. People like her and many others, but that's where this comes from. It also comes from the weakening of the Christian church. You know, when only 36% of senior pastors have a biblical worldview, and only 13% of teaching pastors have a biblical worldview, and only 12% of youth pastors have a biblical worldview, you're going to have a problem. And so in the Christian church today, we have people talking about God and preaching from the Bible that don't trust and or believe God in how they should carry out their everyday lives. You know, I believe this, Trey, that weak pulpits create weak Christians. Weak pulpits create weak Christians. Weak shepherds create weak sheep. And that's what we're contending with today, you know, and I think that now more than ever, we need to have a come to Jesus meeting around the significance and the inerrancy and the infallibility of the Word of God. We need preachers to get back to believing the Word of God from Genesis to Revelations and to preaching the whole counsel of God's truth.